Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ends of the earth. We're actually going to get there this time. For the first time since the series began 7 episodes ago, we are finally going to see someone set foot on the planet's most remote patch of land. We've seen them come in boats and balloons, carried along by dogs and by boots, but for once, we will actually see a group of explorers reach their intended destination. But which explorers will that be exactly? When we last left off, 2 legends stood poised to race. Men who were otherwise peers in their field now stood as competitors, carrying with them the awesome weight of the honor of their respective nations. Englishman and Norwegian, Scott and Amundsen. Both men looked into the dark sky of Antarctic winter, waiting for the signal to begin their relay. The previous summer, they had laid their depots and drafted their plans. All they could do now was to focus on being the fastest. But of course, as we've seen time and again in this series, even the best laid plans are often tentative at best. Things fall apart, people and equipment break down. The winds of the air and fate itself can change on a dime, leaving explorers trapped in the purgatory of an endless white horizon. Both teams knew the risks, and both accepted them as they readied their sleds in the spring of 1912. Who would taste triumph and who would taste death is what we will discover today in the race for the pole. In August, the sun returned and the slow thaw of Antarctic spring began. Both teams were anxious to begin and packed their sledges near the end of the month in order to leave immediately. Theoretically, both teams should have enjoyed a smooth start to the race in the beginning on account of their depots. The English established supply depots along the first third of their journey across the barrier, while the Norwegians had them laid closer to halfway. Both teams assumed extensive depot laying by the other party and took no chances in betting on the efficiency of their own equipment over the other. Amundsen watched the thermometer like a hawk, ready to pounce upon any unseasonably warm weather for a head start against the objections of his fellow men. On September 8th, air temperatures hit negative 27 degrees, and Amundsen perceived that this was his moment. Almost a full month before the start of Antarctic summer, he left his base with 8 men driving their dog teams hard for the south. At first they made good progress, nearly 15 miles a day in some cases, but by the 12th, things began to falter. Temperatures dipped into the negative 60s, and winds blew so strong that they resorted to building igloos to sleep in. Over the course of the next few days, their progress slowed to 4 miles a day, and they were hardly able to sleep through the night. On September 16th, Amundsen accepted that this was not his moment, and ordered the men to return back to base. Along the way, the party split up, resulting in Amundsen arriving a few days before the other group. When they returned frostbitten, he got into a violent argument after the other team accused him of abandoning them. As a result, the group's leader, a man by the name of Johansen, was excluded from the final polar party and demoted for what Amundsen perceived as flagrant insubordination. As September gave way to October, weather on the barrier gradually steadied. The English camp buzzed with activity as the men practiced loading and unloading their sledges, and the ponies and dogs were exercised each day to prepare them for the long journey ahead. Ever aware of the discrepancy of speeds between his beasts of burden, Scott worked out a plan to launch the barrier trek in waves. The motorized sledges were slower and less numerous than the dogs and the ponies, so they would leave a week before everyone else. At some point along the way, the dogs and ponies would catch up with them, and they would travel together to the foot of Beardmore Glacier, where Shackleton had made his ascent. From there, 4 men would lead the dogs and ponies back to base, while 12 men ascended and sledged to the pole. At specified latitudes, groups of 4 would peel off and return back to base, laying depots as they went, while one party of 4 went all the way. If all went according to plan, they would then return, descend the glacier, and rendezvous with a relief party at 1 Ton Depot sometime around the 1st of March, wherein they would return back to base together. This plan fell into motion on October 24th, when Lieutenant Evans started south with the 2 motorized sledges and 3 men. Unbeknownst to them, the true race had started 5 days earlier, when Amundsen left his camp with 52 dogs pulling 5 men and 4 sleds. But Evans' party carried on for about a week, fighting with the sledges every mile of the way until November the 1st, when they refused to start altogether, having made less than 50 miles. This was the same day that the pony party left camp, and determined to make the original rendezvous, Evans ordered the men to abandon the motors and man-haul the remaining 2/3 of the journey. They actually made better time man-hauling, covering 15 to 17 miles a day, and reached their goal 2 weeks later. Meanwhile, Scott had decided to launch the ponies a day ahead of the dogs since they were typically slower. Oates and Scott led the 10-pony team on November 1st, the first day that season in which the air temperatures rose above freezing. The animals remained combative and had to be housed separately each night to prevent the dogs from attacking the poor ponies. Aside from this rivalry, the animals were performing quite well, with each pony pulling between 400 to 600 pounds of supplies, while the 2 dog teams pulled 1,575 pounds between them. However, as the days dragged on, snowfall increased on the barrier, slowing the pace of the animals as the snowdrifts piled up as thick as 4 feet deep at times. Nevertheless, both animal teams caught up with the motor party at One Ton Depot on November 21st, and took some time to regroup and consider their next move. At about 150 miles in, this was the furthest depot they had been able to lay the previous year. The remaining 350 miles ahead of them would require stricter rationing and greater attention to navigation. They resumed their trek on November 24th, after shooting and slaughtering the weakest pony for meat to feed the dogs. As they went along, a terrific storm sidelined them for a few days, and a second pony was shot just 4 days after the first. It seemed that even with a year for them to acclimatize, they were still suffering from the freezing wind. In a stroke of good fortune for the Norwegians, the storm never blew as far east as they were. In fact, they reported only light snow during that period before reaching and ascending the polar plateau on December 5th. But back towards the west, the English were forced to stop a number of times as the ponies trudged on slowly with exhaustion from the cold and from lack of food. Despite their best preparations, there just wasn't enough food to feed the ponies all the way to the glacier, and by early December they had come too far to send them back. Determined to get the most out of them, the kindest members of the party, such as Dr. Wilson, fed the horses their own ration of biscuits before the beasts were flogged on nearly empty stomachs and marched for 7 miles. On that day, December 9th, the remaining 8 ponies were shot and slaughtered at a place called Pony Camp. Their meat was cached, both as a means to feed the returning sled dogs, but also kept in reserve in case the men coming off the glacier needed fresh meat. Just 2 miles from Beardmore Glacier, the men took a day to rest and review their progress. Scott was uneasy about it. They were, by December 10th, a full week behind where Shackleton had been at that time. And what was worse is that they had encountered blizzard conditions across the barrier at a time when the data they had said that they shouldn't. Scott wrote in his journal that he had a, quote, horrid feeling that this was a real bad season. On December 11th, the men left Pony Camp and began ascending the glacier. The weather was good, nearly 20 above zero, which allowed them to make a partial ascent. They used crampons to climb up the ice to affix pulleys and raise the sledges, finally making camp at what they referred to as Lower Glacier Depot. At this point, the dogs had fulfilled their purpose. After being refreshed on the pony meat, a few men led them back north towards the base. 12 of them would now finish the climb and man-haul approximately 200 pounds apiece for about 4 to 10 miles a day for the next week as they continued up and over the glacier. They pushed hard, attempting to make up for time lost to the blizzard. Day after day they labored, sweating so profusely their goggles became too fogged up to be used. By now, they had run out of water and were completely reliant upon melting snow with their stoves. Still, they worked hard and managed to ascend 8,000 feet in 2 days, finally reaching the summit on December 19th. As they looked around at the snow-swept plains of the plateau, they saw no sign of Amundsen's tracks. Scott now turned his attention to the question of who would make up the final polar party. He needed men with particular skills, as the task ahead was not simply a matter of survival, but speed as well. On December 20th, at 85 degrees south, he sent back Cherry Garrard and 3 other men, all of whom, he wrote, were bitterly disappointed. Wilson wrote that the mood was positively mournful, but that they had all parted affectionately. On the 22nd, the remaining 8 split into 2 teams, each pulling 800-pound sledges. The landscape was difficult to negotiate. With no natural barriers to check the wind, snow swirled into great waves like the sea. These formations, known as sastrugi, were so numerous that they could not simply be walked around. Instead, the whole team would have to push or pull their sleds over the crest and very carefully slide it down the trough. Though there were far fewer crevasses on the plateau, they remained an infrequent threat. On Christmas Day, for instance, Lashley celebrated his 44th birthday by falling headlong into a 55-foot crevasse. Fortunately, he was wearing his harness and was pulled out and able to enjoy a feast of pemmican, pony meat, and plum pudding. Despite these obstacles, the men were making consistent progress of about a dozen miles a day. Still, Scott knew he would have to move faster with less men, and as the new year neared, he mulled over who would make up the final polar team. On the 30th, he made an unusual move that is not fully understood by Scott experts to this day. He ordered Lieutenant Evans' team to go ahead of his own and depot their skis while they waited for his team to catch up. He said that this would save time, but it isn't clear why that would be the case. It has been thought by some that he was trying to wear out the other team so that it would make it easier to let them down about not going all the way to the pole. But even so, Scott had his team depot their own skis a few days later, only to turn around the next day and dig them back out of the snow. The whole episode is undoubtedly strange, but perhaps the simplest explanation was that Scott was under tremendous pressure and found himself paralyzed by indecision. Nevertheless, by January 3rd, Scott took action. They were now only 163 miles from the pole and could not allow themselves to be hampered by waiting on one team to catch up to the other. That morning, he went into the tent of Lieutenant Evans, his second in command, the man whom he had named a bay after, and told him that he would not be going with him to the pole. Evans was utterly devastated, but what was worse is that Scott also asked him for Bowers, reasoning that his strength could be better used to increase his team's speed. Evans consented and let the other 2 men know the decision. This meant that of the 5 men going to the pole, 2 would be veterans of Scott's first expedition, and 2 would be newcomers. The veterans were Dr. Wilson and Edgar Evans, while the newcomers were Oates and Bowers. It is thought that Scott wanted the latter 2 for symbolic reasons, Oates representing the Army and Bowers the Navy, thereby spreading the glory evenly. But as hard as this news was for Lieutenant Evans to hear, it was the right call, as he very nearly died on the return journey. Not long after they left, he began passing blood, and as the party encountered blizzards, he weakened to the point of being unable to even crawl. He was finally placed inside of his sleeping bag and lashed to the sled, while Tom Crean and Lashley pulled. They themselves became so weak that they were forced to leave him behind in a tent and hiked 30 miles, 18 hours non-stop back to base. After being revived with a bit of food, a dog sled team went back and retrieved a nearly dead lieutenant. Back on the plateau, Scott estimated that they were now only 10 or 11 days away from the pole. In spite of their setbacks, they finally caught up to Ernest Shackleton's record on January 9th, where he had turned back at 88 degrees 23 minutes south. This, however, was the period which Shackleton described as the dark days of hunger, and the path before them was still unmapped. Nevertheless, the men bounded on, determined to return alive and as champions. They struggled on for days at an inconsistent pace. This was because Bowers had no skis, as he had been part of the team that Scott told to depot them. As a result, they were forced to cycle him out with someone with skis, while whomever he replaced walked beside the sledge. The closer they got to the pole, the terrain became more rugged and difficult to navigate with the skis. They were also higher, more than 10,500 feet, or nearly 2 miles high in elevation. They weren't aware of this at the time, but it is important for us to remember today that higher altitudes have a number of effects on the body. This includes longer digestion times, increased respiration, and decrease of thirst. These issues slowly crept up on the men, so that they were not at first aware that they were becoming weaker and experiencing the first stages of dehydration. They pushed these thoughts to the back of their mind as the thrill of the race and resounding optimism increased each hour they drew closer to the pole. On the 15th, they stopped and made their final depot. The pole was no more than a day's journey away, so they decided to leave most of their food and non-essential equipment there to lighten the load. That night, Scott wrote in his journal, quote, "It is wonderful to think that 2 long marches would land us at the pole. We left our depot with 9 days' provisions, so that it ought to be a certain thing now, and the only appalling possibility, the sight of the Norwegians' flag forestalling ours. We ought to do it now." Unquote. The men broke camp early on the morning of the 16th, and with their sleds hundreds of pounds lighter, they practically bounded over the snow. As they made their way along, Bowers said that he could see something in the distance. Gradually, all the men saw a distant black shape against the endless white horizon. Was it a pile of rocks? Was it some strange formation the likes of which they had not yet encountered on the plateau? As they drew closer, they realized it could be none of these things, as it seemed to be moving slightly. Then, all at once, it hit them. It was a banner. As they approached it, they saw shapes in the snow winding up to it. At length, they recognized them for what they were: sled tracks and paw prints. Finally, they drew close enough to the banner and recognized it: a Norwegian flag. They were too late. Dr. Wilson, seeing that the flag was already beginning to fray, guessed that it must have been there for a couple of weeks. The following day, they discovered that he was right, as they marched up on a tent, and found a letter from Amundsen inside, dated a month earlier. Around the same time that the English team had made their way halfway across the barrier in November, the Norwegians had already reached the Trans-Antarctic Mountains. Unlike Scott, they had no trail to follow, and so spent days probing the mountains for a spot to climb. They eventually found it in the form of a steep glacier, which they went on to name for one of their patrons. For 3 days, they climbed the 30-mile slope with their dogs and sleds in tow before finally ascending to the plateau. Once they reached the top, they found themselves in a predicament. As with Scott's animals, Amundsen's were in rough shape. 7 of the original 45 had died on the barrier, and several more looked as though they could go at any time. With time running out, Amundsen made the hard choice to slay the weakest 18 of them. Each team was responsible for killing and skinning them, dividing half the meat for the other dogs and half for themselves. Amundsen wrote of the experience, quote, "We called the place the butcher's shop. There was depression and sadness in the air. We had grown so fond of our dogs." Unquote. The Norwegians remained at the butcher's shop for a few days, depoting supplies for the return journey. On November 25th, they set out with 60 days' worth of food into the unknown. Their progress was slow as fog hung thick in the air, working with the snow to hide treacherous crevasses. On December 8th, they passed Shackleton's record and searched the horizon for any sign of the English. By the 13th, they were only 15 miles from the pole, and on the morning of the 14th, Amundsen walked ahead of the sledges until he passed 90 degrees south, the first man to stand on the South Pole. He later wrote of the experience, quote, "I have never known any man to be placed in such a diametrically opposite position to the goal of his desires as I was at that moment. The North Pole had attracted me from childhood, and here I was at the South Pole." Unquote. And with that, the 5 frostbitten men raised the Norwegian flag with pride. To be absolutely certain that they had indeed reached the pole, Amundsen had 3 men to ski out in a 12.5-mile radius, taking care to make a precise reading of the sextant. Afterward, they erected a tent and celebrated with cigars. They stayed there for a few days, planning their return and shedding gear. Before they left on December 18th, Amundsen left behind a letter for King Haakon VII and a brief note to Scott asking him to forward it on. They then made their way back to camp 23 days later, having gone to the pole and back in just 49 days. The note they left behind read, "Dear Captain Scott, as you are probably the first to reach this area after us, I will ask you to kindly forward this letter to King Haakon VII. If you can use any of the articles in the tent, please do not hesitate to do so. The sledge left outside may be of use to you. With kind regards, I wish you a safe return. Yours truly, Roald Amundsen." As the weary, frostbitten Englishmen read these words, they did so with tremendous disappointment in their hearts. In a letter to his wife, Bowers wrote that he was awfully sorry for Captain Scott, who has taken the blow very well indeed. Keeping a stiff upper lip, as they are known to do, the English likewise skied the area to ensure that they had reached the pole before celebrating with cigarettes. They took some time to survey what Amundsen had left them. A sled, 3 bags of reindeer mitts, and other supplies, along with some navigational equipment. As the men sat down to dinner, Scott mulled over the task ahead. It was now January 19th. Daily minimum temperatures were in the -20s and would only drop from there as Antarctic winter came on. All of the men were frostbitten in some way or another, and the rations were so light that they were putting the men into a calorie deficit. Only swift travel and precise navigation would allow them to make it back to camp before winter, and if they could get back to camp, Scott believed that perhaps they could still save face by beating Amundsen back to Australia and telegraphing the news to the world. As the men began their march back north on January 20th, Scott's mind stayed on the race, writing in his journal, "Now for a desperate struggle to get the news through first. I wonder if we can do it." By now, the men had been on the plateau for a month. For 1 month, their bodies were forced to work harder and accept less nutrition than they would have at sea level. This, along with a desperate lack of vitamins and hydration, was gradually reducing what they could achieve with the hours in the day. The warning signs of exhaustion came on slowly, and at first they had been able to ignore them with the excitement of victory burning hot inside of them. But as they began their dour trudge back to shore, they began to feel every ache and pang more acutely, and the danger of missing one of the depots became increasingly real. There was one thing working in their favor, however. Before beginning their journey, the men experimented with attaching poles to their sleds and fashioning a canvas sail to it. Having enjoyed minor success, 2 were packed to be used for the last groups making their returns. The sail was vital in making up ground as Lieutenant Evans's health began to decline, and the men of the Polar Party hoped that it would help them now that the supply depots were no longer fully stocked. The sail did indeed prove to be a help, but it could not do all the work. The sastrugi made for an uneven surface, and so they sailed in intervals and man-hauled when the ground turned rough. 4 days after setting out, they found themselves caught in a blizzard, sidelining them for the day. When they awoke the next morning, they discovered a number of Edgar Evans's fingers were frostbitten, as was Oates' foot, and Dr. Wilson was experiencing excruciating snow blindness. For 5 days, the men marched on in their miserable state, pacing unevenly as Bowers was still without his skis. Blizzard-like conditions continued, obscuring their original tracks and forcing them to make regular stops and find their position. Missing even one depot at this point would have been fatal, and so the party began sacrificing speed for precision. On the 31st, they reached 3 Degree Depot, where Bowers had depoted his skis, blessedly bringing them some relief to the pulling. But even so, the man-hauling was becoming increasingly difficult as their overall health deteriorated. Evans' frostbitten fingers began to die, turning hard and shedding fingernails, and Dr. Wilson strained his legs so badly that he had to be pulled at times. Nevertheless, the men refreshed themselves on extra rations and set out anew as February began. At first, the strong winds proved to be a boon, helping them to cover 20 miles a day for the following 3 days. But the good times didn't last long. On the 2nd, Evans fell into a crevasse, greatly injuring his hands, which gushed with pus and shook uncontrollably. They took days to cross a crevasse-riddled part of the land, during which Oates' toes turned black, and all of their vitamin-deprived skins began easily tearing. Passing by this section, however, Dr. Wilson made an interesting discovery. He found coal with leaf imprints, discovering the first bit of evidence that Antarctica had at one time enjoyed a tropical climate. From the 9th to the 12th, they began to navigate around huge chasms as they drew closer to the ridge of Beardmore Glacier. They made it to another depot, this one nearly depleted of rations, with even less oil for their stove. And yet, despite this setback, they began to feel hope for the first time in weeks that Evans' health might actually improve. But that hope did not last long, as during that time Evans's personality began to change after taking a long fall into a crevasse on the 14th. The change was immediate, as Scott disclosed in his journal that he was almost certainly sick in the brain and required a close watch as it made the other men anxious to be around. By the end of the day, he collapsed, sick and giddy, forcing them to make camp. As time went on, he became too much of a detriment to help pull the sledge, so instead he skied behind the rest of the group, coming up to them occasionally, looking wild and disheveled. On the 17th, he dropped out of sight for some time, before skiing up just before 11:30 and reporting that he had fainted somewhere. They decided to stop and put up their tent, placing him inside. He promptly collapsed comatose and died an hour later. The exact cause of his death remains a matter of speculation to this day. Was it starvation, exhaustion, a brain injury, or some combination of these three? We can only guess, but whatever the case, it came as a morbid relief to the rest of the party who had their own miseries to look after. The day that Evans died, the team reached the depot at the foot of Beardmore Glacier. Whatever lay ahead of them, they could at least face it without the privation that higher altitudes inflicted. Temperatures were also a little warmer, with minimums in the -10s, thanks to the mountains blocking a bit of the wind. The men slept under the shadow of the glacier that night, refreshing themselves with the last of the horse meat before striking out to cover the last 500 miles between them and Hut Point. Without Evans, they found that they made better time, making nearly 9 miles a day. They deployed the sail to travel even faster, but unfortunately, the wind blew them off course, causing them to lose the trail. It took them 2 days to find their way again, before making it to South Barrier Depot. To lose the trail and miss a depot would have spelled certain death, so they decided to forego using the sail again. But even finding the depot offered little respite. They discovered that the food stores were nearly empty, and the oil tins were indeed completely empty due to the leaking problem. It was February 27th, and winter was coming. For the first time in months, the sun began to dip below the horizon for a few hours a day, forcing them to endure the dark of night and temperatures which dipped to nearly -30. They knew that they had to pick up the pace, but the dropping temperatures actively worked against them as they caused Oates' frostbite to spread from his toes to his feet. Frostbitten appendages were something to be expected and endured during such expeditions, but frostbitten feet often spelled certain doom. Footgear could not easily be dried, as it was often the primary protection of the biting cold of the wind. Even if a man were to leave them off overnight to dry, it could take as long as an hour to force his blackening feet into the stiff folds of the boot. By the beginning of March, this was the position Oates found himself in. His feet had become so lame that he could only manage a mile an hour, slowing the team's progress to a mere 6 to 8 miles a day. Dr. Wilson's health deteriorated as well. He wrote in his journal that his hunger had not been satisfied since coming off the glacier nearly 3 weeks before, but that he tried to keep his mind off his own ailments by attending to the other men. On March the 5th, they reached another depot, marking the midway point across the barrier, where they once again discovered a meager store of fuel and oil. That night, as the men sat in the dark, -40-degree air, they privately wondered in their diaries about their chances of making it back to base alive. Their hopes were pinned on reaching One Ton Depot, that farthest point that they had been able to reach the previous year, and where teams of dog sleds and relief men should be waiting. They still had miles and miles left to march, and as their bodies grew weaker and the nights grew colder, death or life felt as equally certain outcomes. They marched on for a week against shortening days and sapping winds. On the 10th, Oates asked Dr. Wilson if he thought that he would make it, to which Wilson replied honestly that he did not know. Scott wrote in his own journal, quote, "In point of fact, he has none. Apart from him, if he went under now, I doubt whether we could get through. The weather conditions are awful, and our gear gets steadily more icy and difficult to manage." Unquote. For more than 2 weeks, the men had been enduring minimum temperatures of less than -30, colder than the climate data suggested it should be. For all intents and purposes, Antarctic winter was now upon them. The unusually cold weather made it feel as though they were pulling their sled across desert sands, and their progress slowed to less than 5 miles a day. Oates' frostbitten feet became too much of an impediment for the men, and so they staked their tent and looked south, hopeful that the relief team would understand that they had missed their rendezvous and were in need of rescue. For days they remained in the tent, as temperatures dropped into the -40s. Their hands became so frostbitten that only Scott continued to write in his journal. Ever aware of the burden he was placing on the others, Oates implored them to continue on and leave him in his sleeping bag. The others roundly refused, and so Oates summoned the last bit of strength he had to walk with them another 6 miles before they were stopped by strong winds. As they set up the tent for the evening, he went into his sleeping bag and announced that he hoped that he would not awake the next day. As the sun rose on the morning of the 16th, the men began to wonder why a dog sled team had not come to their rescue. Scott began to suspect that they had in fact overshot their rendezvous point and were now lost to the rescue party. Much to Oates' chagrin, he rose that day as well and remained despondent throughout the afternoon. At some point during the day, he put on his boots and opened the flap of the tent. Looking over his shoulder, he said, "I am just going outside, and may be some time," before stepping out into the blizzard. Scott wrote of the experience, quote, "We knew that poor Oates was walking to his death, but though we tried to dissuade him, we knew it was an act of a brave man and an English gentleman. We all hope to meet the end with a similar spirit, and assuredly, the end is not far." Unquote. The men by now believed that there was no coming back from this. If there was no rescue party to relieve them, they could not possibly finish their march north in this unseasonably cold weather. Nevertheless, perhaps as a point of honor for Oates' sacrifice, they were determined to make one more go of it. Despite the relentless winds and shortening days, the party packed up camp once more and marched on. 1 Ton Depot was still out there, and so too should be the relief party to carry them swiftly back to safety. The men held on to this hope and pushed themselves for all they had. But hope, unfortunately, could only do so much. On the 21st of March, they were forced to stop once more, just 11 miles shy of the rendezvous point. Scott's feet had become as useless as Oates, and the other men were in no shape to pull him. In addition to his feet, frostbite was quickly advancing upon his hands, leading him to write in his journal that amputation was a foregone conclusion. Like Oates, he was now keenly aware of the detriment he was placing on the others, and encouraged them to carry on to the depot. Bowers and Wilson considered the matter seriously, deciding that perhaps they were close enough to send a dog sled back for Scott. Plans were made for them to leave everything behind and attempt to make the march in 1 day, but those plans fell through. After an honest assessment, they came to believe that they just didn't have it in them. As the snow deepened and the nights grew longer, the 3 of them huddled together, singing hymns and looking south, somewhere between accepting death and holding out hope that the rescue team had not forgotten them and would push beyond the rendezvous point and find them in time. Waking, dreaming, waking dreams. Impressions of the past, momentary lapses in the present. It's all together and then apart, like waves of consciousness, gently lapping at an orange shore, a foot in 2 different worlds. Somewhere in the dozing haze, a line of poetry comes to you, calling from the way back of boyhood, ever drifting down the stream, lingering in the golden gleam. Life, what is it but a dream? Who wrote that? Couldn't say. But every day, what little day is left here, has felt like a dream for some time. You are aware of a light somewhere. Is it behind your eyelids or in front of your open pupils? Not sure, but it's an awfully hot light. Your whole torso feels damp and warm. With some great effort, you run your hands along it, trying to wick away the sweat. But you don't feel your torso. You don't feel anything. You're just aware of the sound of rustling. Suddenly you gasp. You jolt like a man who caught himself falling asleep. Your eyes are definitely open. You are certainly awake. The dim twilight that passes for day now is faintly illuminating the canvas tent around you. You think about sitting up, but decide it isn't worth the trouble. You hear the wind outside rustling the canvas, and faintly wish that a bolt of cold air may breeze through the tent and cool you off. You have to do something about the heat. You wonder how the others are standing it. Slowly and methodically, you think through what you need to do. You are in a sleeping bag, no doubt bundled in too many layers. The first thing is to get your arms free of this first sack. Then you can worry about the coat or whatever you're wearing. One step at a time, one foot in front of the other. You move your arms like a man swimming through molasses. They are numb for the most part, which makes it difficult to work out where they are and in which direction you're moving them. You work them like this for some time, whatever time is, until you see the knuckles of your right hand emerge from the darkness. It looks funny to you in this unfocused gaze, but you aren't sure why. Slowly and deliberately, you push it up until it's out of the bag. You bring it closer and inspect it. The fingers are black as coal and hooked into a kind of claw. They'll cut them off, no doubt, along with about half your hand from the looks of it. No trouble. No trouble at all, really. The main thing is to focus on cooling off. Think. Use this claw to your advantage. All right. You hook it on the lip of your bag. You think. You can't actually feel it, so you have to crane your neck to verify. Yes. Okay, good. You pull at it, meekly, and realize you'll have to do better than that. Summoning up what strength you have left, you pull hard at the fur fabric until you feel yourself emerging from the bag. Like a bear emerging from a long winter's nap. You see the crook of your left arm and orient it in your mind, gradually pulling it free as well. Good. Now you have two claws to work with. You can do something with that. You attempt to feel your coat and work out the next step, but it's no good. There's just no feeling left in these old fingers. No matter. Even having your arms out of the bag brings some small relief. You pull your fingers up to your neck and bring them down, sliding them roughly across your skin and against whatever you're wearing. If you keep doing this, you may eventually get it off. As you work your hands up and down in the semi-darkness, you look over at your companions, realizing that you may be disturbing them. It's hard to make out, but the man next to you looks like he's sleeping. You turn your head over the other way and see someone next to you doing the same. You can't be sure in this lusterless light, but he almost looks blue, particularly around the lips. Another line comes to you from the way back. Long has paled that sunny sky. Echoes fade and memories die. Autumn frosts have slain July. Who wrote that? Couldn't say. You suddenly hear a tearing sound, thread giving way and a cool breath on your chest. Oh, relief, blessed relief. Like the soft breath of a lover and the smoldering afterglow of passion. You chuckle softly. The mind goes funny places here. Your head lulls, your vision blurs, and you smile as your mind drifts. The wind is almost rhythmic. You think of the wisp of snow outside swaying like couples at a ball, twirling apart, bowing, and coming back together in a swirl. By slow degrees, you can even hear it. The breeze outside melts into waves of music. There's a kind of atmosphere that sounds like synchronized footsteps, the careless chatter of gay couples, the crackling of a fire. A Christmas ball. Some other time, some other place, but right here with you. The warm, hearty voices of friends, the shrilling laughter of wives. The taste of brandy sends heat up your stomach. It's so good to be out of the cold. So good to not be alone. It's just awfully hot. Dancing does that, you suppose. You think you'll have a word with whoever is manning the fire. But first you'll step onto the dance floor and just sway along with the others for a while. The sorrow of that time went untold for months. Outside of the southern continent, the world was reacting to the exhilarating news that Roald Amundsen had won the race to the pole. As it happened, the Norwegians were able to depart before winter fell, sailing the Fram to Hobart, Tasmania on March 7th. While he was there, he met a recovering Lieutenant Evans, who had been brought for medical treatment aboard the Terra Nova. He was astounded to learn that Scott had chosen to manhaul instead of using dogs. As Scott's team lay starving in their tent in the maelstrom of a blizzard, Amundsen sent telegrams to his brother, Fridtjof Nansen, and King Haakon, informing them of their triumph. He gave interviews and toured South and North America giving lectures. In time, the men received medals from the king, and congratulations poured in from the likes of President Roosevelt and King George V of England. Even Scott's wife Kathleen wrote that his journey was a very fine feat. In spite of one's irritation, one has to admire it. A tinge of irritation was, of course, felt throughout the British Empire. Scott had been the first to reach the plateau, and many held out hope that he would likewise be the first to the pole. In the wake of Amundsen's victory, interest in Scott's party waned somewhat amongst the public. Still, those in exploring circles looked forward to Antarctic summer so they could hear Scott's own account and determine how close the race had actually been. The sunless days stretched long in Antarctica. The all-encompassing black of night and bone-chilling winds of winter were an outward reflection of the gloomy souls at Hut Point. They passed their time as they had the previous winter, taking atmospheric readings, giving lectures, and writing to loved ones. However, these tasks were done with none of the mirth of that earlier season, but instead with the banal melancholy of those fated to retrieve the bodies of friends when summer's warmth finally returned. The first rays of sunlight came back in October, and by the end of the month, a search party was formed to return to One Ton Depot. Cherry Garrard was actually against this, as at that time the scientific team to the north had likewise not been heard from all season, and he reasoned that it would be a better use of resources to retrieve still living men. He, however, was the lone voice of dissent, and instead the relief party marched south to retrieve their fallen comrades. They marched against the abating winter winds for nearly 2 weeks before reaching the depot on November 11th. They discovered that it was in fact just as Cherry Garrard had left it, except of course that the fuel had leaked into the snow. They pressed on, and the next day, sitting under about 6 inches of snow, they found the remains of Scott's tent. Gingerly, they opened up the tomb and surveyed the scene inside. Bowers and Wilson lay encased in their sleeping bags, while Scott lay partially out of his, arms wrapped around the others in a final embrace. The recovery team removed the contents of the tent and began reading through the men's diaries. They recovered 35 pounds of specimens, including Wilson's coal samples depicting the imprints of tropical plants. They discovered in their readings of the journals that Scott had been the last one to keep writing, and had most likely died on the day that Cherry Garrard turned back to camp, a fact which haunted him for the rest of his life. But amongst the writings, they came across a statement, a final word that Scott had for the world to know of their struggle. In it, he laid out the reasons for the disaster, mistiming on his part, and the unseasonably cold weather they were forced to slog through. He placed no blame on his men or their supplies, saying that the preparations were entirely adequate and that no one could have predicted the hardships the weather would cause them. He closed the statement with these lines, quote, "We took risks. We knew we took them. Things have come out against us, and therefore we have no cause for complaint, but bow to the will of Providence, determined still to do our best to the last. But if we have been willing to give our lives to this enterprise, which is for the honor of our country, I appeal to our countrymen to see that those who depend on us are properly cared for. Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions which would have stirred the heart of every Englishman. These rough notes and our dead bodies must tell the tale, but surely, a great rich country like ours will see that those who are dependent on us are properly cared for. R. Scott." Unquote. The rescue party was stirred by the sight of where the bodies laid, and so they chose not to move them, but instead to seal the tent back up and erect a tall stone cairn affixed with a cross in their memory. They returned to Hut Point on the 26th and met the northern party who had survived their own ordeal and began packing up the camp with the hopes that the Terra Nova would soon arrive. It took 5 weeks before it returned in January, during which time the men erected a cross overlooking the bay on Observation Hill. It was inscribed with the names of the 5 fallen, along with this line from Tennyson's Ulysses: "To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." The expedition began their long voyage home towards the end of January, arriving first in New Zealand on February 10th, 1913, a little more than 2 years after they had last seen civilization. Word was sent of Scott's fate, and the men braced themselves for what they would face back in England. What they discovered was a stir of the nation's spirit. The tragedy of their companions' deaths overshadowed the triumph of Amundsen, and even in death, the men became icons to the Anglo nations. Their tale was taught to children, and a memorial service was held in St. Paul's Cathedral. The fervor roused the public who, taken with Scott's last letter to them, demanded that the government pay the men who bravely stayed behind after funding had ran out. The government did so, and in death, Scott was knighted. His widow Kathleen, while not as obsessed as Lady Franklin, did her best to preserve Scott's memory, going so far as to sculpt memorial statues for him, 2 of which can be found in the harbors of Portsmouth and Christchurch. Scott remained for some time a national hero beyond rebuke, the tale of his sacrifice standing as a worthy example for Britons the world over. However, in time, a critical eye was leveled at the memoirs of the surviving crew, and questions were raised. Gradually, many began to level accusations of hastiness, poor planning, and overconfidence. Many began to see the man as possessed by a bygone colonial spirit who needlessly sacrificed himself and his crew for Pyrrhic prestige. In recent years, however, even these criticisms have been called into question. The fascination that the race for the poles excited in the public's mind undoubtedly catapulted scientific discovery in places otherwise unreachable. It was only because nations were willing to give so much of themselves that we have gained what understanding that we have of the Earth's magnetic field and the part its polar atmosphere plays on the rest of the worlds. Regardless of the motivations that drove men into the globe's wild, frozen wilderness, they ultimately paved the way for a more complete comprehension of our planet today. And from that comprehension, we now know that ultimately Scott was onto something about the weather. With decades of weather data from the southern continent, we now know that the expedition was forced to contend with temperatures 15 to 20 degrees colder than usual, in addition to the storms they encountered. Like Captain Franklin before him, regardless of the preparations, he was destined to face a harsher climate than anyone could have anticipated. For Amundsen's part, he kept on exploring the Arctic, next turning his attention to carving out the Northeast Passage, in which he sailed from the Kara Sea over Russia into Seattle. He flew over the North Pole in a balloon, the first fully verifiable man to do so. He sailed on into the undying annals of polar history in 1928, when he disappeared somewhere over the Arctic in an airplane, searching for another explorer's airship that had gone down. The year after the Terra Nova returned, Shackleton relaunched his quest for the South Pole. His tale is one of its own right. From 1914 to 1917, he made an incredible journey across Antarctica and back to civilization. After tracing Scott's trail, his ship the Endurance became crushed in the ice, stranding the expedition's 28 men. They made camp on ice floes, and eventually Shackleton and a small crew sailed 800 miles in a lifeboat across the open ocean to South Georgia, where they secured a rescue ship for the other men. After nearly 3 years, they asked for news of the world, only to discover that Europe had gone mad and torn itself apart. War, of course, became the national pastime for much of the 20th century. Empires declined, funds fell, and only serious scientific ventures received substantial funding. Man, though, never satisfied, kept on exploring. The excitement for the ends of the earth turned towards the tallest peaks. Geographic societies spent their funds on explorers brave enough to scale the tallest mountains, and gradually the spirit of going toe-to-toe with Mother Nature became a private pursuit instead of a national one. This is where our saga ends. Earth's farthest corners were finally reached, with trails of bodies guiding our way today. Of course, in history, nothing truly ends. Every preceding event has only been prelude to the present. We, the living, connect those events and decide for ourselves how to make a narrative of them. And this is where I choose to end this one. Well, folks, that's a wrap. That does it for a saga that was months, years in the making. It's been a while, and as I've mentioned before, not something I thought would take this long. As Jim Morrison once said, the future is uncertain, and the end is always near. And bearing that in mind, we don't intend to lock ourselves into another series like this, at least not while we both still have day jobs to attend to. So what does the future hold then? Well, I can't say exactly. At some point in the near future, Michael and I are going to sit down and have a little retrospective on this whole storyline. I realize that Arctic Talk is kind of stale bread with this program, but reading and writing about it for the last year and a half has been a bit of an undertaking, and I'd like to look back on some of the takeaways we've had from it. I'll save my personal feelings for that conversation, but I'll say frankly, all of this has given me a newfound respect for this part of history. A part of history I didn't really have an interest in prior. And I'm guessing for anyone who has slogged through all these episodes, maybe that's true for you too. I'm always impressed to look at our metrics and see listener counts, city by city, and seeing that we actually have fans of the show out there. It means a lot to both of us, and I sincerely hope that our topics have been informative and thought-provoking in some way. And for anybody who's new to the show, let me say, I appreciate you as well. If you don't know already, we're on most major social media platforms, including Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. If you happen to peruse those sites, give us a follow, and you'll be in the know about any new updates or bonus content we have coming out. And while you're there, comment on anything that stands out to you. Whether you like the show or you think it needs improvement, all feedback is very much welcomed. But that is going to do it for now. Stay tuned for the next episode where Michael and I will look back on this long series and talk about the show's future. Until then, I'm Graham Parker, you've been listening to Grisly History, and I'll see you in the next one.